Hi, everybody, to this next episode of Said Differently, brought to you by Troupe. I'm your host, Jennifer Sikora. I'm a Troupe advisor. And this is the place where we get into topics around telling stories, specifically B2B messaging and how we bring our stories to market. Today's topic is a really interesting one because it was inspired by a LinkedIn post of our guest, Chad, which is really around what is the difference between product market fit and message market fit, especially as a company evolves over time from those early stages of founder-led sales, moving into scale-up phase, and then into the more mature growth phases. So, Chad, he and I met a couple months ago through LinkedIn, and he's brilliant head of product marketing. Lots of background, started as a marketing analyst in 1998. Has held various product marketing leadership positions, both in-house and as a consultant, and has been involved with agencies. And so, Chad, I'd love to let you introduce yourself to folks a little bit more.
Yeah, I won't go all the way back to 1998. I'll come a little bit closer. So really, there's sort of two parts that I think are relevant. First part, I spent 11 years as one of the founders and principals of a B2B marketing agency, which is now part of a group called Next 15. But the sort of first 5 years of that agency, we were working with large global technology players. So we're talking Dell, Microsoft, SAP, Sony, Ricoh, uh, 25, 30 countries, multiple languages, huge growing orgs, and that was great. That's really where you learn the sort of system of messaging, where you've got to get it right, you've got to cascade it, you've got to keep it consistent, you've got to, put tools and processes in place to keep it consistent for fairly long periods of time. But as that agency went forward and we started to move into the next 15 group, our profile of our customer base started to become earlier and earlier. So you're
Wow.
talking Series B, Series C, pre-IPO, private
Yeah.
equity backed, slightly post-IPO, and now you're moving into messier territory.
Mhm.
So the second half of that agency's life was moving into businesses where you had companies going into successive rounds of investment, categories that were growing and evolving, product roadmaps that were very busy, and organizations that were scaling around them. And you start to have all this stuff coming together. And at some point, you have to start to pick up and say, who are we talking to? What are we saying? What's the signal to the noise? And how do we know whether we're telling the right story? And that really put me on the journey to becoming the product marketing consultant, which I do now. So after that, I spent the last 7 years inside companies, usually at key inflection points,
Great.
trying to help them just sort of see that direction and decide what story do we need to be telling for
Mhm.
where we are, knowing what we know in terms of what got us to here, but having a clear eye on where we're trying to get to and trying to make sense of all of that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's interesting too because similar to you, well, not similar to you in certain ways, but in some ways I've been mostly involved with the sort of Series B through D size
Mhm.
companies, and now I'm involved with even much earlier stage companies, as a
Yeah.
consultant for the 24 and up startup studio, of which Troop is one of the startups, and product market fit is sort of this obsession or fixation in those early stages, and it has to be. But I would argue that message market fit plays a big role as well because you're also selling a vision in the early stages, right? You're not just selling the product, but those early adopters are buying into a product that isn't maybe as mature as you would in a Series C or even D stage. So talk us through what do you see, Chad, or like the differences between how do you delineate product market fit and message market fit? How do you see those two having some distinct definitions?
Yeah, they do overlap. And again, I'm a product marketer, so I'm going to tell you that messaging and positioning are important from day one.
Yep.
But a couple of things. As you go from startup into scale up into bigger companies, there are different moving parts. So first off, when you're a startup, you're perhaps a founder-led company
Mhm.
selling a solution that's quite innovative, possibly in a new category. So you're going to benefit from all of that. There's some novelty in there. There's that passion and that charisma of the founder.
Yeah.
You potentially talking to early adopters who go out and seek new technology.
Yes.
So your message is about the potential, and you're perhaps talking to like minds, and you're using that experience of the founder who's maybe lived and breathed that problem themselves, which is why they've why they've created this business.
Right.
And you're iterating quickly through this product and you're bringing on these early adopters. So yeah, get the message right. Be really clear on your problem space. Be really clear on what you're trying to do, and sell the dream. And you're talking to an audience that's going to be pretty receptive to that, and that can get you pretty far. That gets businesses to 20 million, that gets businesses to 30 million. Sometimes it gets businesses to 50 million just on product market fit alone. But
Hmm.
at some point, growth is going to get harder.
Yeah.
Things may start to flatten out, and that's when you see that difference really start to come out because you start to move into a more mainstream audience who is perhaps more risk averse. They aren't necessarily those early adopters just looking at innovation. They need more proof, they need more validation. They need to go beyond just understanding the product value proposition. They need to understand, how would I get my internal team to use this? How would I get my customers to use this? How am I going to change around this?
Yeah.
Um, how do I get over the risk of just doing anything at all? Because sometimes doing nothing at all and just staying doing what you're doing is the safest bet for buyers who are not in that mindset of earlier adopters. And that's really where you see the difference. You can have really good product market fit, but if your message isn't evolving to start to talk to that customer
Yeah.
group, which is moving, you're going to find that growth gets more difficult.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I see. So said differently, I'm going to stick with the theme of our show. Like
Yeah.
you could see once that product market fit is found and established with that certain set of those early adopters, really good message market fit can be an accelerant on that then.
Exactly. And again, there's a couple of different things happening. I think early on, a startup can get the benefit of, selling the dream, selling a bit of the vision. They also do have to be very, very clear on who they're for and what they're for.
Yes.
But because you're sort of mixing in a little bit of that early market with the innovation and a bit of the dream,
Yeah.
you you can perhaps accept for some allowance that the founder or your initial very experienced executives are going to fill some of those gaps. You can perhaps accommodate for the fact that customers who are a bit more on the front foot are going to mentally fill some of those gaps, and they're going to buy anyway because they're just excited. They're excited and you're excited. But
Yeah.
when you move it further forward, you can't allow for those gaps. And you're also have a bigger team telling the story. You've got a
Yeah.
bigger marketing organization. You've got bigger channels. You've got more deals, more opportunities where the founder and that senior team are not involved to fill those gaps.
That's
So,
true.
so the messaging has to work harder on its
Yeah,
own.
yeah, because at that point you're looking for your go-to-market edge and to really start to be self-sufficient. No, I don't mean self-sufficient, but self-sufficient without the founder involved in every single touch point. You just can't. You can't scale that way. It's impossible.
Exactly.
So when we
Exactly.
were doing our prep for this, you had talked about your experience with Dext and
Yeah.
as a good example, and you said it would be fine to talk about them specifically. It's a good example of like getting through that sort of growth evolution and that life cycle hump, if you will. And can you talk a little bit more about what that specific experience taught you? So,
Yeah, so Dex is an accounting software product. It works alongside the Zeros and the QuickBooks of the world. And the accounting market is such a great example of this. You have roughly a third of that market who are accountants who are quite forward thinking in terms of technology. They're actively building their practices around new technology. They're thinking all the time about, how can I save time? How can I be more profitable? How
yeah.
can I make systems and processes
I'm just
better?
gonna say I'm surprised that there's no ding to accountants, but the fact that there's a third of them that are that way, applause to accountants.
I might even be stretching it. So when you go out with a new product, there's in that group, there's an interest, and you're going to go out and say, hey, look at what we can do. It's going to save you time. It's going to make life easier for your clients. It's going to
Yeah,
make you a more profitable practice. And they're like, sign me up. I'm willing to try it. I'm willing to see how it goes. And you know what? I'll take responsibility for getting my team to use that.
great.
I'll
Yeah.
make sure I'll go talk to my clients how to do it because I'm confident in technology. But once you start to move out of that early adopter set into your more mainstream, you're slightly, later than early adopter. These are people
More
that are now
conservative
thinking,
buyers. Yep,
more
that's right.
conservative buyers, they're thinking, ooh, this is going to be a lot of change now. And,
Hmm.
how do I talk to my clients about this? I've never had to talk to clients about technology. I've never had to price technology. I've got to get people internally on board. I've got to change process. Suddenly, change becomes hard.
Yeah.
Change becomes risky. I can tell you another thing, accountants are really fearful of having to support technology in their client base. So even though they might see the benefit of the product, they're still fearful of making that leap because it's going to introduce new complexity into their client relationships.
Sure.
So it's a perfect example of where the message has to move on. Great product, clearly defined market, clearly defined product value proposition about what it physically does.
Right.
But how are we going to hold your hand to get you over those worries, those humps internally around adoption, those fears you have about supporting product? And that's where other parts of your value proposition come into play. How are we going to educate you and your team? How are we going to support you? How does our customer success offering come to the forefront? How can we help you learn from your peers?
Yeah.
For example, how can we give you trust that other accountants like you have been able to do this and have found the ROI to be highly worthwhile? So there's just a bigger story that has to come along with the decision making as you move out of that early adopter market.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's right. And in those, this is a great example of the fact that your target buyer hasn't changed. It's still an accountant. I'm assuming many of the attributes of the
Mhm.
persona and the ICP are similar, but psychologically, as a buyer, they're in a different place than your early adopter set. So even though on paper they look very similar, there's psychographics and different buying behaviors and buying mentality that's at play.
That's exactly it. So, you've mentioned it there. So the segmentation might be on firmographics, are they small, medium, or large? But
Mhm.
actually, the velocity in the sales process is going to come from psychographics. How willing are they to adopt new technology and make change?
Right.
And that's where the messaging can really help that. And what you start to
Yeah.
see as sort of evidence that this is happening is you end up with very happy existing customers who are renewing. Churn is low, but you're starting to see new deals get slower and
Slower.
slower. And
Right.
that's how you know you've got a message market
Yeah.
fit problem,
More
not
do
a product
nothing
market.
decisions, right?
Yeah, because you're getting this great, you're sitting there thinking, how can I be getting existing customers telling me that they love our product and they're signing up for renewals and our churn is pretty good,
Mm.
but yet new deals are stalling. New
Yeah.
deals are ending in no decision. That's when you start to know you have a message market fit.
That's a
And
really
not
good signal to look for, Chad. And I was actually going to ask you about signals in general. So that's a good segue. I mean, I would think there are times, and I can think of some examples from my own experience, when you actually are brought back to issues around maybe not product market fit, maybe it's message market fit, not really sure what it is, but something has happened, right? Either a competitor has come in and is really starting to blow you out of the water. Maybe
Mm.
there's some dynamics in your market that have shifted and changed. Maybe there's been an M&A event or something. Like, what are other signals you should look for to know that it's a message market fit issue and not a product market fit issue? But the lines can blur, as you said before, too.
They can, and the problem you have is it can be really difficult to separate signal from noise on this. But there are really two sides, I think, to that story. There's an internal side, particularly if you're a sales-led organization.
Yeah.
You'll start to see um, a sales organization that's probably growing and it's probably scaling, and you'll start to see very different levels of performance between your star performers
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of your team. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a really clear indicator that something's wrong because the product is the same. And you are starting to figure out the adage that the product sells itself is not true. So those star performers, sometimes they'll do well no matter what the message is because they're good at filling the gaps. They'll run on charisma. They're
Yeah.
they're they're great at problem solving, but
Yeah.
the rest are struggling with that. So you're seeing a lack of confidence and you'll actually start to see behavior change. You'll see some of those sales reps if you've changed ICP or you decided to move up market, they'll retreat to old patterns, right?
Yes.
They'll not be moving on and what they're telling you is they lack the confidence to have the right type of conversation with that new audience. So they'll often defer their time and energy to things that they're comfortable with. So that's an internal signal. From an external signal, you're really starting to look at, I think you're looking at a couple of things. You're looking at velocity through the sales funnel. You want to see leads coming in. You want to see them moving through. You
Yeah.
want to see champions who will still act a lot like your early adopters. You want to
Yeah.
see them starting to use your messaging internally when they start to talk to their people. And when you start to go into conversations, you want to hear back some of the messaging that you've used when they describe it back to you. And
Mhm.
that's proof that that
Yeah.
message is going beyond the asset or beyond the conversation. And it's actually being used to move that deal forward inside an organization. So you can start to pull that out of call scripts. You can start to pull that out of conversations. You start to see, consumption of the assets you're creating, whether it be the buyer's guides, the sales assets, the videos, actually starting to land. And again, you're starting to see some of that language actually come back in the market. You're starting to see customers going, that's a great with prospects. I think that's a
Yeah.
great way for me to describe it. But I think it really comes down to velocity. I think if you've got that message market fit problem, you're starting to see maybe leads come in at the top of the funnel, but they're getting stuck
So,
and you're
so,
not seeing them move and you're seeing them stall at sort of middle or bottom. And that's when I think you've got a message fit. There is one other really key point which does come up from now and again
yeah.
is early stage churn, which can tell you that you've actually
Oh,
brought in customers who don't understand what your product does. And that usually happens in lower value products where it's
of
quite
course.
quick to come in to trial. I like it. Maybe
Yes.
somebody I know told me to use it. I've come in. I've thought it was something. It's
Yeah.
not, and I've churned quite quickly. So you can also see some signals there as
That's a
well.
good point. I really love a lot of the signals that you identified. And as you were talking, it also made I was reminded about that we also can't forget to bring our customers along with the story, right? But especially older customers, they may have come on board when your story and your message was not the one that you're going to market with now. If they signed up with you 4, 5, 6 years ago, and you now have a more robust story, a bigger vision, right? Those customers might still think of you in this retro state, and you have to bring them along too.
Yeah, and that's where measurement becomes key because it gets even more confusing when early customers are giving you feedback, which isn't the same as what, maybe your evolved ICP is telling you. And you've got to find a way to figure out what's actually driving momentum here. Is it
Yeah.
is it still the product keeping those customers retained? Where if new customers, same product, but I've got to rely on new messaging or evolved messaging to pull customers through the funnel.
Yeah. So we certainly aren't intending to make this an advertisement for, or advertisement, as you may say in the UK, for Troop. Um,
Yeah.
but Troop obviously helps companies really measure what is happening with their messaging. But why do you think it's been so hard to measure this? Putting Troop aside, why has this been difficult? Why has it been a challenge? And product marketing has really struggled with this from a
Yeah.
metric standpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a few companies, not very many and not nearly as many as they should be, do some message testing up front. And I'm a big believer that you should do some message testing up front. But when you really start to scale that messaging out into the organization and you start to want to feed it through your marketing channels and your sales channels, and if you're a business who runs through partnerships, through your partner channels, I think it becomes invisible. I just don't think the tools have been adequate enough to do that. And you start to run into, again, a lot of noise. You run into internal noise. You start to run into internal people, sales teams, sales leaders, people who are having conversations, giving you different versions of feedback based on their personal experience. Some will be right, some will be difficult to sort of parse out the truth. You start to, just have more marketing activity and more marketing assets out in the field where you're getting engagement metrics, but
Yeah,
that's not necessarily telling you what message is working.
that's right.
And,
Yeah, you
again,
could
not
have clever creative, you could have a clever call to action, but yeah.
yeah, and where what I think has been, missing is the ability, and I think this has been a technology hurdle, is the ability to start to take your messaging framework, your messaging documents, all of that substance, and actually start to break it down into components,
Mhm.
different value statements, different proof points, different ROI statements, different feature messages, different parts of your value proposition, and really track where you're using it,
Mhm.
track where it's coming into conversations, and then match that against the engagement and the conversion. And that's where you're really starting to couple this more granular view of which message was used to create that engagement or to create that conversion, or vice versa? Where are we seeing trends between where we've gone off message, we've not used what we've been trying to use, and we've had lower conversion? Or the worst of all is we've done a big piece of messaging, put it out there, and it's not working.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
it's the ability to start to break messaging down into its components, see it where it's being used, measure it, track it back
Yeah.
against results. And that's why I was very excited when we looked at Shoot for the first time.
Agreed. And I think, I know the way I used to approach it as a product marketer, and it was easier when you were a smaller company. I would have one-on-ones every week with each member of the sales organization. You can only do that up until a certain point, but sales needs to feel part of the process as well. They can't feel like they're
Yeah.
just being simply policed. They have really valuable input. They're on the front lines delivering that message every single day to real human beings. And so we've got to get them into the fold as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. And all the things about that one-to-one time still stand. I think we've got a lot smarter on
Mhm.
things like call tracking, the ability to analyze,
Sure.
sales activity at scale, and that's all helpful. And it works exactly alongside this
Yeah.
is, get that direct engagement, learn from your best performing reps, understand what's happening in perhaps the lower performing sort of cohorts in your team. But bring what the tools and what AI are allowing you to do is to actually not just look for small fragments of information, which can be very hard to piece together, but actually see the whole picture. And I think that's what's really interesting.
Fantastic. Thanks, Chad, for your time today. You're looking for clients and engagements, or what are you up to now?
Yeah, I am. So I left Next after it sold at the end of last year, and I went back out into the consulting world and really looking to work with businesses right at that scale up stage, sort of that 30 to 50 million, pardon me, sort of 30 to 100 million dollar
Great.
a year mark. And usually those companies are bringing us in at some sort of inflection point. They've expanded geographically. There's been a merger or an
Yes.
acquisition, a new round has catalyzed a bunch of product development, new executives are coming in, and so there's a time to reset. But I'd also sort of just map that back. Exactly what we're talking about here is that's usually a really good signal that it's time to reset the messaging. The old schedule used to be, give the messaging a refresh and a polish once a year because that's what you should do. But I think it's much more about looking at these inflection points and being able to say, do we have the story right? Do we have the history of knowing what worked? Do we have the story right for where we're going? And can we measure it? Because we don't have a lot of time to get it wrong. And that's very much what we're trying to do with companies at this scale up stage.
Great. Okay, well, you'd be a real asset for anyone who works with you, Chad. Thank you for so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
All right,
Thank you
take
so
care.
much.